Hi, I'm Raymond Simonson. I'm the CEO of JW3, London's Jewish Community Centre and the UK's only Jewish arts and culture venue of its kind. Sadly, as you know, we've had to temporarily close our doors at the moment. We've got to think about people's health and safety, and we're listening to government advice. But just because we've stopped doing what we normally do in the way that we do it, it doesn't mean we have to completely stop what we're doing and what we're best at. And that is to increase the quality, variety and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. So we've got some treats for you. We are going to put on a whole load of our digital archive that we've been building up over the last 6 years of some amazing events. We're going to make them absolutely free of charge to you. And whilst you sit down with a cup of tea and put your feet up and watch this amazing thing you're about to see now, our team are going to be planning for a whole bunch of events that we're going to put on digitally over the coming months. For now, this one's on us, it's free. But you know, everything that we do costs money. And at the moment, we don't have the same income streams that we've got. So if you can spare a few pennies, a few shekels, if you can click donate online, that'll be really wonderful. We'd be so grateful for it. If you can do that, that's great. But either way, please sit back and enjoy. We'll see you again soon.
To JW3, to all of you. Nice to see so many familiar faces, and as always, nice to see some faces that we haven't seen here for a long time. Welcome back. My name is Raymond Simonson. I am privileged to be the CEO of this wonderful Jewish Community Centre. Now, those of you who have heard me speak before are likely to have heard me explain that JW3's mission is to increase the quality, the variety and the volume of Jewish conversation, both within and outside of the Jewish community. And 3 months before we opened our doors of this wonderful community centre back in 2013, we held our very first private event on this very stage with an audience of invited guests from across the Jewish community. It was our first chance to put this mission into practice, to see if we could indeed begin to increase the quality, the variety and the volume of Jewish conversation in a way that could be transformative and impactful and inspirational across the community. So we knew there was only one person that we had to invite to join our founder, Dame Vivian Duffield, on this stage for that very special first event. It was the then Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks. And of course it proved to be a memorable and inspiring evening. I think there are at least 1 or 2 people here in the room tonight that were there then. So I'm delighted that Rabbi Lord Sacks has returned to JW3 many times since for more inspiring events. So of course it's a genuine honour for me personally to be welcoming him back here this evening to mark the launch of his new book that I can see you have a copy of, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. Now Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks barely needs an introduction to a JW3 audience, so you'll be pleased to hear I'll keep it brief. He is, as I'm sure all of you will know, an international religious leader, philosopher, award-winning author of over 30 books, and a respected moral voice who was awarded the prestigious Templeton Prize in 2016 in recognition of his work in affirming life's spiritual dimension. He's a frequent and respected contributor to radio, television and the press in Britain and indeed around the world. And I know that at an event yesterday discussing this book, the former editor of The Times, James Hardy, introduced Rabbi Sacks by saying, "He is to Thought for the Day what Claudia Winkleman is to Strictly." Slightly more seriously, the Daily Telegraph have called him Britain's most authentically prophetic voice, and the Times describes him as one of the most engaging thinkers of our time, and I think we can all agree they are both right. This evening, Rabbi Sacks will be in conversation with Elizabeth Oldfield, the director of Theos, a UK-based religion and society think tank with a broad Christian basis. Elizabeth is also the host of the Sacred Podcast, on which she interviews people with a public voice about their deepest values and what they have learned about engaging across divides and across differences. She appears regularly in the media, and her writing has been featured in a wide range of publications from the Financial Times to The Economist and much more. And before joining Theos, Elizabeth worked for the BBC in television and in radio and ran MediaNet, providing pastoral support for individuals across media. She has an MA in Theology and the Arts from King's College London. We're delighted that she joins us and Rabbi Sachs this evening. So please will you welcome Elizabeth and Rabbi Lord Sachs to the stage.
Good evening, and I have to offer congratulations to those moral individuals who served the common good by moving down in their row to create space for other people to come in. That was our first test. There will be many more. Brace yourselves. Or not. Perhaps you can relax. Rabbi Sachs, this book feels to me a bit like something that you've been building up to through all your work. It draws together so many threads from the books and the talking and your public presence that we've known and loved. But I'd love to hear the specific origin story. What triggered this book now?
Before I begin, Elizabeth, can I just recognize the presence here from Hodder of Ian Metcalf and Jessica and members of the team. I just want to say a very special thanks to them because this book would not have been the same book without them. Ian has challenged me on every point as if he were a member of our congregation. And it was just thrilling to work with you and with the Hodder team, and thank you. I tell you what happened. It just felt as if things were going wrong in all sorts of directions. You know, in 2016, after the American presidential election, we had 3 years, 2016 to 2019, when the British government closely resembled a shul board meeting. A lot of argument and not much progress. 2016 American presidential election, I asked a friend of mine, a very, very bright man who lives in Washington, what it felt like. And he replied, I said this in my TED speech, he said it felt exactly like the man standing on the deck of the Titanic, holding a tumbler of whiskey in his hand and saying, I know I asked for ice, but this is ridiculous. So we had this feeling that politics is somehow becoming, in America, in England, even in Israel today, with the election results in Israel, dysfunctional. Secondly, it was a very, very strong sense that the economy was becoming dysfunctional. I talk about income inequality in the book, but to have Ray Dalio was the head of Bridgewater Capital, the world's largest hedge fund. He himself, we met at TED, he himself is the 57th richest person on earth. And he has said publicly that income inequality in America is a national emergency and an existential threat to the future of the United States. So we've got a really dysfunctional economics in which just a few are getting mega rich, but a lot of people are either remaining static or seeing in real terms their income decline. We had a few days ago Gary Kasparov, the former world chess champion, saying that over 90% of jobs are going to be significantly affected by artificial intelligence. We saw a year or two ago the government for the first time create a so-called minister for loneliness. You have a lot of different phenomena. And what I wanted to know was, are they all separate phenomena, each with their own set of causes, or is there something connecting them all? Now we have a very good example of phenomena which seem completely different, and yet all have a single cause. The unprecedented heat in Australia, the unprecedented cold in Delhi, in India, floods in some parts of the world, droughts in other parts of the world, and they seem to be contradictory, and yet they're all part of climate change. And I thought about this for years and finally came to the conclusion that all the phenomena we're seeing today are part of cultural climate change. We have, over the last 50 or so years, in different ways and for different reasons, become much less cohesive as a collective sense of we, and much more emphasis on the individual and individualistic sense of I. It happened in 3 stages. Number 1, the social revolution in the 60s. Number 2, the economic revolution in the 80s, Thatcherism and Reaganomics. Number 3, the technological revolution that brought us smartphones and social media. We need to have those two in balance, and today we have too much individual self-interest and too little pursuit of the common good.
And you use the word common good, and that's the subtitle of the book, and your argument is very much about the common, about a restoring of the we. So I'm fascinated why you chose the M word, and some context here is I used to work on the moral maze, and I realised how much people disliked the concept of morality. Trying to get them to make a moral argument is incredibly difficult as a researcher. People say, well, the evidence shows, or, you know, they felt like a moral argument would be judgmental and would be about kind of the moral majority or individual moral choices. What made you go for that word and that title? Are you trying to rebrand it and reclaim it?
Because it's out of fashion, it's totally politically incorrect. I remember I used to open something called National Marriage Week. The first time we did this, years ago, somebody came up to me and said, Chief Rabbi, isn't marriage terribly politically incorrect? And I said, of course it is. If it weren't, why should I bother celebrating it in a marriage week? You know, it's the countercultural things that are worth saying. Morality has, as a word, as a concept, has been out of favor for far too long. And what I'm trying in this book to say is, no, morality is not just a set of thou shalt nots. It's not just somebody objecting to your enjoying yourself. Morality is this code and set of virtues that human beings have always evolved because we need the help and company of others. We need a sense of what makes of belonging to something bigger than I am.
So if it's not just jealousy with a halo, as you quote someone calling
Jealousy
it.
with a halo, yes.
Yeah. What is your definition of morality? Give me your punchiest version.
Morality is that set of habits of the heart that cause us to seek the welfare of others and take that as seriously as we take the welfare of ourselves.
There's a concept in the book that I've not come across before that comes from Durkheim, and the word is anomie. Is that how you say it? Anomie?
Yeah.
Anomie?
Yeah.
And it's been going round around my head ever since because it seems to describe the opposite of what you've just said and sums up the state that we're in. What does anomie mean, and what does it lead to?
Durkheim was writing, incidentally, Durkheim was a secular Jew, was nonetheless the son, grandson, and great-grandson of rabbis. And I'm sure you know, Elizabeth, that synagogues are pretty community places. And for us, community is tremendously important. And he understood the role of religion is to bind people together into a group. And he realized, and he wrote his book, Suicide, in 1897, that the hold of religion was fading fast in Paris, where he was. And the result was that he could see already that people no longer had a shared moral code. Nomos, as in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second, and nomos means law. So amoral means you're not moral. So means without, and nomos means law. So if you're in a state of anomie, you don't belong to a moral order. Yeah? You don't have anything to guide you in the society as a whole as to how you should behave and how you should live. Durkheim made an astonishing prediction. He said, any society in a condition of anomie, without a shared moral code, you will see suicide rates rise. Now, this was totally revolutionary because don't forget he was one, together with Max Weber, these were the two first sociologists. Nobody thought sociologically. And everyone thought, God forbid, suicide, it's a terrible tragedy, but it is always and only an individual tragedy. You can never predict rates. You just can't. And he said, you can. And he was right. And in the book, I bring the evidence of Jean Twenge from San Diego, who has shown that from 2012 onwards, among teenagers, there's been a sudden rise in suicides and attempted suicides. And in Britain, 2 years ago, the figure was published that a quarter of 14-year-old girls in Britain, 23% actually, had self-harmed in the previous year. Now that's an astonishing figure. So it is to Durkheim, whom most people have forgotten, that we owe this insight that if we don't have something binding us together, we will see an enormous increase in personal isolation, in loneliness, and in despair.
And trace for me the connection between individualism and this sense of meaninglessness, because I think the narrative today is that you find your own meaning, that you shape your own meaning. In some ways, the only true meaning, only true meaningful life is the one that you determine for yourself. Why do you think that's not the case?
Well, here's a good example. How do we communicate meaning in the most normal, prosaic sense? Through language. We talk, we listen. So now let's follow this one through. In order to be truly authentic, you invent your own language. The only trouble is, since nobody else speaks it, you can't communicate. So there's no way of becoming an individual by inventing your own language. There's no way you can become an individual by inventing your own morality. You may think you're individual, actually you're just copying everyone else. So I think we've been bamboozled by this word individualism. The truth is, you can only really be individual by internalizing a code. Let me give you an example. Take any painter, right? Take Monet, take Van Gogh, take Cézanne. First of all, they have to learn the language of all those artists who came before them. And then once they've really internalized that, they can produce work that is very, very individual. There is no I that is not born and nurtured by a collective we.
You connect morality to meaning. You also connect it very strongly to freedom. You say only moral societies can sustain freedom. And again, the associations that most people have with morality is constraint, not freedom. Why do you think those two things go together?
Well, you know, John Locke was pretty clear that a free society depends on people pursuing liberty, not license. What's the difference between liberty and license? License is doing whatever you want, and liberty is doing whatever you ought. Can you imagine a society in which every single person decided, well, I'm going to decide this morning on the basis of my mood which side of the road I'm going to drive on? You can't do it. Without shared rules, you can't have free movement of traffic. Without shared rules, you can't have a free society. Isaiah Berlin used to believe that it was freedom from rather than freedom to. He said, freedom to the pike means death to the minnows. So you have a completely lawless free society. The most powerful exploit the most powerless. And that is not then a free society. It's only free for the guys at the top.
One of the things that you trace the process of happening is this idea that we have outsourced morality to the state on one hand and to the market on the other. Could you say a bit more about that, and also why did that happen?
People kind of thought in the following terms. Morality is a matter of two bits. Number one, the choices you make, and number two, the consequences of the choices you make. Well, the choices you make, the market does that, okay? You can choose whatever you want so long as it's legal and you can afford it. And if you're a member of Amazon Prime, they deliver it to your door. So that's the market deals with choice. The consequences of the choice are dealt with by the state. So, you've had a bad marriage, the state picks up the pieces with your children, and so on and so forth. The trouble is, once you outsource morality in those two directions, you have essentially outsourced your very self. Because we are made by the ideals we live for and the sacrifices we make for those ideals. And since we don't need to have any ideals, we don't need to make any sacrifices, our lives are simply there as consumers and as voters. As consumers in the market, as voters in the state. And that's just crazy. The truth is, it is what we make for ourselves as families, communities, congregations, charities, voluntary associations, everything that goes under the heading of civil society. That's where the moral muscles are exercised. Now, two things. One thing made Britain and America in the 19th century different from anywhere else. Britain and America had large voluntary sectors, really big, much more than any mainland European country had. So they had individuals who were used to acting for the common good and making sacrifices and having ideals. And the result is those two countries, Britain and America, sustained freedom at a time when it was toppled in one mainland European country after another. So the thing was put to the test, and it really was true. The thing that Locke had said, the thing that Alexis de Tocqueville had said, that it is in families and communities that we develop the antidote to individualism, that voluntary and passionate concern for the common good.
You talk a lot about this third space, this sense of civil society, these smaller groups of belonging, Burke's little platoons. And we can see, of course, the data shows that it's not just religious belonging that's going down, it's belonging to unions, to really anything that's not leisure-based, forms of belongings that require something of us, that are more long-term and sustained. Obviously, this taps into the whole history of the growth of individualism, but what do you think drove that? What were the key moments that meant that those bonds that held those smaller units of belonging and growing in the common good, when did they start to dissolve?
Well, they started to dissolve around the 60s, as I said, and it's just accelerated over time. So Robert Putnam of Harvard, who has really been a partner on this journey with me, and he is really, I mean, I'm just the student here, he's the master. He discovered in the 90s that more Americans than ever were going 10-pin bowling, and fewer than ever were joining bowling clubs and bowling leagues. So he called that bowling alone, and that became his metaphor for individualistic society. And he sent out the warning signal way back, 24 years ago, that this was getting serious. And it affected us in other ways too. Music. Do you remember the days when people had record players and even before Alexa, and we listened together, but as soon as the Sony Walkman appeared and then the iPod appeared, suddenly music became something that I listened to on my own. And now social media are all about, presenting myself and other people presenting themselves to me. So all in all, the things that bring us together in really close textured relationships have lost their power, except the religious ones for the most part. There are charities that do this very well, but people tend to think that if you've got a lot of people, if you've got a viral video or something, or a lot of likes on YouTube, that's community, and it isn't. That is a crowd. There's a big difference between a community and a crowd. A crowd are 1,000 people in the same space, literal or metaphorical. A community are 100 people who know one another and who miss one another if they're not there.
One of the things you do brilliantly in the book is you trace this history of individualism, but what's really noticeable, all of these kind of spikes, after the wars of religion, their sense of forms of shared moral code and belonging can be divisive, after the First and Second World Wars into the 60s, shaped by a sense of some moral codes and some forms of belonging, some communitarian visions can be tyrannical and can cause deep harm. And aren't we safer in individualism? And it's that sense of actually people are trying to move towards what looks like the good. But do you feel that pushback, that sense that actually there might be a risk in moving back from an I society to a we society? Could there not just be that space for people to grab for power?
You go too far to a we society and you get China. You don't want that. I want a balance between the we and the I. And the person who put it best was Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer asked, what do porcupines do in winter? If they stay too far apart, they freeze in the cold. If they get too close together, they injure one another with their spines. So porcupines have to strike that balance between too close and too distant. And maintaining that balance is a constant challenge. We don't want the oppressive and repressive societies of the past. We want the generosity and tolerance that flowed from the 60s onwards. We don't want to go back to the Dark Ages. We really don't. But I do think there are too many people out there who have lost out economically, who are devoiced politically, who are lonely, who are vulnerable, who don't have networks of support. And we can't sit here comfortably saying, that's not us. We are responsible for one another. And that's a very deep Jewish belief. We call it Kol Yisrael Arevin Ze B'Zeh. We are all responsible for one another. And I think the same applies to any country.
One of the things I wanted to ask about the 60s, because you come again and again to this as a pivot point. You identify several pivot points of this growth, this what's brought us here, but the 60s is a real key one for you. I just wanted to be quite vulnerable really, and say that I think the question of gender and the way that works in that moment is quite key. Because one of the real changes in the 60s was the contraceptive pill that allowed women's lives to be more outside the home, that allowed them to have more choice over when and if they had children. And as I study a bit in my work, the kind of history of religion, there's often this sense that Victorian Christianity was shaped by this idea of the angel at the hearth, that women would be the ones who would hold community, would hold togetherness, would be responsible for relationships, and that's one of the roles that has perhaps disproportionately fallen to them, or perhaps not. And so as I was thinking about what would a more we-based society look like, one of my questions is, how could that be equally shared? How could that not be something that women felt was more their responsibility to carry than others? Is that something that came up in your thinking at all?
Well, it did, because it's a generational thing. Namely, I'm an old man, and our children and children-in-law are new men who share the parenting duties pretty equally. I'm not going to look in their direction right now because I don't want to start a family argument. But I think that's a change that I didn't go through, that they, a generation on, have gone through. And I doff my yarmulke to them because it's really impressive. And seeing the empowerment of women today within Judaism and within the wider world much more so, is something that I find moving, necessary, and one of the things that makes me feel I am privileged to be alive at such a time. I am not in this book saying that the best way to move forward to meet the challenges of the 21st century is to march boldly back into the 19th. I'm really not. I'm saying I think we as a society have to reflect together on what kind of society we wish to create for the sake of generations not yet born, and what do we collectively undertake in order to help that into being. I use the concept of covenant here because covenant means morals by agreement. You come together as a group and say, we agree to be bound by this vision. That is, a covenant is actually a secular idea that was turned into a religious idea by the Hebrew Bible, but it existed as a secular idea before the Hebrew Bible. It's the ancient Near Eastern treatise. So it is essentially a secular idea, one that was used with great power by the shapers of America in the 17th and 18th century, and has remained part of the American political discourse ever since. And it's the right kind of morality, because it doesn't say you have to believe that God said these words from heaven. You have to say, we are coming together to deliberate, and we will be bound by those deliberations.
I do love what you're writing about covenantal choices and the way that we re-establish a sense of covenant in society. And one of the key chapters is about the fragility of the family, and this one of our most kind of beautiful and sustained covenants is the covenant of marriage. But I can feel your tension as you're writing about it, and I think it goes more broadly for when we're talking about morality, when we're talking about togetherness, that when we try and talk about what we think might be the best way for people to flourish, the best way for children to flourish, it's very easy for those who either haven't or couldn't make those choices, perhaps they're divorced, perhaps they're single parents through no choice of their own, perhaps economic factors have just made that more difficult for them, which we know, marriage is much less stable if you don't have financial backing, if you don't have an extended family. There are lots and lots of pressures that people are receiving this culture of individualism, and often through no fault of their own making choices that contribute to it and don't look covenantal. But we also want to talk about them. And you say, in trying not to be judgmental, we can't give up on talking about the good and the things that we think are good. What did you learn in writing that chapter, and how can we navigate that deep tension that these choices are so personal for people and often so painful that we almost much more want to avoid it?
Well, I'll be blunt with you, I think we have to be very, very non-judgmental. I think you can talk about the beauty of family without specifying which kind of family. I don't think family in itself is sufficient, because families need the support of a community. And therefore, my personal commitment is, I just eliminated the "thou shalt not" from my vocabulary, because I just don't think anyone can hear that today, and I don't think it's even fair to criticize people for things that they really had very little control over. I just think we have to recognize that individualism reaches a limit. And when it comes to bringing children into the world, you do have a right to say, John Stuart Mill wrote this, that, since I am bringing this into the world, I commit myself to caring for the welfare of this. And very often that means the bond of marriage, which is much more stable than any bond of cohabitation. So, I think we can have a clear ideal of what works and what we want to encourage. At the same time, we have to recognize that there are a lot of people who don't and can't live out that ideal, and society has to be supportive of them.
Talk to me about this idea of a common morality, and it's a thread through so much of the book, Durkheim's sense of a common morality, a shared set of values, that what we're missing, sense of placing ourselves in an overarching story. And then towards the end of the book, as you get into solutions, you talk about which morality, and you lay out various different approaches to it. And the metaphor you use is, it's like learning a language, you have to pick one. And you basically say, pick a morality, join a community, live it out, seek the common good in that way. And I was left with this question of, might that not just, given that those moralities can come into conflict, might that not just pull us further apart? Or is that just a pragmatic decision that we're just not in the position where we can have a completely shared one?
Well, I tried to hint there, whenever I have to say something really difficult, I make it extremely oblique. If you want to get under the door rather than through it, you have to sort of lie horizontal. So, the point is that the Greek or Hellenistic ethic of duty is tied up with an idea, the greatness of Greece, the greatness of Rome, is tied up with an idea that I frankly find unacceptable, because in Hellenistic ethics, the individual served the state rather than the state serving the individual. Your highest aim was to serve the polis, and dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, how sweet and beautiful it is to die for the fatherland. I don't think we want that kind of thing.
You do think some moralities are better than others?
I think that some moralities are us and some are really not us, and that only one morality, the morality that we broadly call the Judeo-Christian heritage, ever gave rise to liberal democracy. Only one ethic ever gave rise, originally, to the free market. Max Weber the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, by which he meant the Calvinistic ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It was that Puritan ethic that created the market economy, and it created the free society. Calvinists were very strict on themselves, and I don't think I'd necessarily like too many of them as neighbours. But the truth is, it was that ethic that led to the two things that made the West completely different. Don't forget, China was ahead of us until the 16th century, and then suddenly the West zooms ahead. And the Chinese wanted to know why, and you remember I quote Niall Ferguson in the book. The Chinese Academy of Social Science tasked a committee to find out why did the West suddenly surge ahead. And they said at first we thought it was your economic. Firstly, we thought it was your weapons. You had better weapons than we did. Then we looked a bit deeper and we said no, that was to do with your political system. You had democracy. Then we looked a little deeper and we saw, no, you had the market economy. And then we looked deeper still and we finally realized it was your religion. And that is what the Chinese said. So I think there is, there are all sorts of ethics. If you go to, a really Hindu country, there are different ways of saying good morning, depending on whether the person you're talking to is a lower caste than you, or the same caste, or a higher caste. So there are beautiful moral systems, like the Hindu system, that are attached to completely hierarchical societies. Only the statement in Genesis 1 that all human beings are in the image and likeness of God grounds a society of equality. So I was kind of saying choose whichever you like, but I was quite trying to nudge people to choose the Judeo-Christian ethic.
Yeah.
I just didn't say so. That's
So I'm
all.
going to push you on it, and you may end up horizontal on the stage.
Yeah.
But because that was what I was left with, and I understand why, and from my work elsewhere, that actually the urgency of this book, and I did feel it. I was quite emotional reading it. The urgency of the call means that we do need everyone. We absolutely need everyone. And if those who aren't religious feel excluded or judged or looked down on, then nothing's going to change. And it is, and we have our own stuff, as we know. But our religious communities in general, have our own wounds and baggage and failures and failings. But every example that you gave of the tide turning, you talked about the Great Awakening in America and what happened through primarily black-led churches and the way that changed the social fabric of the States. You talked about the Victorian social transformation that happened under the Victorians, triggered largely by a small group of slightly nutjob evangelicals living in Clapham in shared houses, including William Wilberforce, and the social transformation that came after that. And that confidence and the sense of not being ashamed or apologetic about the transcendent, and the way a sense of divine command or the love of God or that shared language of something beyond us holds us together in these communities that can seek the common good very imperfectly, but sustainedly. You can't leave God out of it. And so I sort of wanted you to pull your punches less. That's my challenge.
There are two theories of communication. Theory 1, say what you feel. Theory 2, say what can be heard. And there are different forms of communication. So, I write lots of books that are religious books. You don't see them because they're not for a non-Jewish public. And in those books I say what I feel because I know I'm sharing a language, I'm sharing texts with a Jewish readership. And sometimes slightly beyond because those are biblical texts and sometimes Christians read them. And there I can say what I feel because I'm speaking to like-minded individuals. But when it comes to a call that is this urgent, I really have to judge what can be heard. And if somebody read this book and put it down, I mean an atheist, an agnostic, and said, you know what, I've read this whole book. You know what? He wants me to believe in God. That's what it's all about. I would have killed this book stone dead. And I have no intention of killing this book stone dead because I think our situation is quite severe and it needs somebody to say something. So I developed different ways of speaking. And in this book I speak as a student of, as we mentioned before, Bernard Williams and Philippa Foot and Roger Scruton, three outstanding moral philosophers who were my tutors. And I'm writing, as it were, with the left hand on this one. And quite calculatedly so, because religious writing in today's public writes itself into a ghetto. And as a result, fails to influence those who are not yet converted.
Thank you. I think I heard it as a clarion call for those who are people of faith, not to be arrogant, not to be dismissive, to be humble, but to realise how much good we could do, how much of a noble call there might be for us to help turn the tide in a way that serves others, that seeks their good. You know, that isn't a power grab for influence, but is about the common good. So I wanted to thank you for it. Final question before we open up to the floor. You open the book quoting Alistair MacIntyre saying, basically, that this anomie, this loss of general morality, heralds the coming age of barbarism and darkness, which I underlined with a big exclamation mark. And then you end talking about Generation Z and reasons to be kind of hopeful. I feel personally that climate change is a moment which will test our mettle, that we will either do this or we're done for in some ways, that the impetus might be coming and we wish it would have come another way. But how hopeful are you? How much do you vacillate between hope and despair? And what would be the final thing you'd want to kind of say to help sustain people's hope so that we can act?
Well, look, first of all, it says in the Dictionary of National Biography about one of my predecessors, the late Chief Rabbi J.H. Hertz, that he never despaired of a peaceful solution once every other alternative had been exhausted. So I never despair of humanity doing the right thing once every alternative has been exhausted. However, I now want to make an absolutely fundamental distinction between optimism and hope. People think that they are similar. They are not remotely similar. Optimism is the belief that things are going to get better. Hope is the belief that if we work together hard enough, we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue and hope is an active one. It takes no courage, just a certain naivete to be an optimist. But sometimes it takes a great deal of courage to have hope. No Jew, knowing our history and the history of humanity, can be an optimist. But no Jew worthy of the name ever gave up hope, and I will never give up hope.
Right, we have about 25 minutes now. I'm realising that my live radio training is still in me because that's exactly on the minute for when we're supposed to open for questions. If you want to say your name and anything about yourself, but in short form, please do. We'll go to the lady at the front to begin with. There is a couple of roving mics, if you could just pause to let them get to you. I will say, I think this is being recorded. I'm looking to an organiser, but just, yes, it's being recorded, so don't say anything on mic you'd rather not be recorded. Come and talk privately afterwards.
My name is Irene Mansfield. I've got it the wrong way round. I'm not a technophile, I fear. You mentioned, Rabbi Sachs, that you didn't want the Judeo-Christian ethic to be foisted on people, but I'm intrigued what you see how you see morality coming about. Because after all, Marxists think that their code is a moral code, and other extremes think that their code is a moral code. We think that the Judeo-Christian ethic is our moral code, but if we don't want to persuade others of that, how do we cope with all the different moral codes?
I think we have to show people the consequences of moral choices. Marxism, under Stalin, destroyed human freedom, created a totalitarian state, created the Gulag and the KGB. It created a famine which cost between 10 and 20 million lives. Marxism is as discredited an ideology as it is possible to have. There are new forms, neo-Marxist forms, which I confront directly in the book. I don't say at all, let it be. No way, because I think Marxism in any of its forms is completely devastating to human freedom. So I think we have to argue every single case and show what adopting a certain way of seeing the world, what it results in. So that is how you argue it, not by forcing it by authority, but by showing it through the telling of the consequences of adopting that approach.
Thank you. Do you mind just passing it up? We'll go round, gentlemen, about a few rows behind you. Oh, mic's coming from all directions. There we go. Thank you.
My name is John Wigham, and I'm delighted to see my initials there on the screen. You seem to be a very...
Well, that's two of you. Where's number 3, please?
We seem to be a very secular society now. If we were more God-fearing, wouldn't morality follow?
I would hope. You see, my way of opening people's eyes to religion is to show how it does actually help us to become much more moral people. That's not the only way of doing it, because another way is much more spiritual people, but that's quite different. And I was fascinated by when I wrote this book, I said I'm going to try and make it as inclusive as possible so that even very secular people could read it and feel it spoke to them. But I was fascinated in the course of some of the conversations we've had about the book that very secular people who read the book said to me, Rabbi Sacks, don't you think we need religion to make us moral again? So that was really, really interesting. It was completely unexpected. And I hope this will be one consequence. And I hope we can show... I do think, though, we have a job of work to be done here. And that is, and we've worked at it quite hard in Britain, that we have to show that the different religions in this country can be respectful of one another. That becomes terribly important. Because in some very religious societies, religion becomes a form of intolerance. So I think you're right, and I would hope people do feel that this book is a sort of horizontal, low-key argument for religion. It actually is. And it is saying that if you believe in someone and something bigger than yourself, you will be led to act for others beyond yourself.
Let's go, gentleman in the middle with the gilet. You can get yourself into hot water describing people. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great description, by the way. Rabbi Lord Sacks, technology. Can you talk a little bit about the role that technology plays? Because on the one hand, we live in a more connected world with the advent of the internet and social media, but at the same time, there are challenges with people being individual. And the role that technology plays, good, bad, or otherwise.
Yeah, technology has been a huge driver of all this. And there's good news and bad news. Technology does allow us to be much more easily connected to one another, but it has some pretty bad side effects. So in the book I point out the fact that a lot of the evidence suggests, a lot, not all of it, that spending more than 2 hours a day on social media leads to depression, especially among teenagers, and especially as it happens, teenage girls. So I think it's quite important for us to think of setting limits. I think more and more people, interestingly enough, are rediscovering one of the oldest religious institutions of all time, the Sabbath, because the Sabbath is becoming the screen-free day. No smartphones, no tablets, no texting away under the table. And a lot of people are calling the Sabbath a digital detox and rediscovering it. I think what really scares me more than anything is what is called the disinhibition effect, that you can be much ruder communicating electronically than you would if you were talking to somebody face to face. And that has led to abuse, to hate, to cyberbullying. It's led, God forbid, to suicides. You know some of the more famous cases in recent times. And, I'm beginning to feel that the social media companies, the big companies, really ought to take some responsibility here for limiting the communication of hate electronically. They are perfectly capable of developing the algorithms that are appropriate, and I think they should be held responsible, not as publishers. And they would act very, very fast. Indeed, just a week ago, Mark Zuckerberg said that he recognizes that there is a need for greater legislative control of social media. So I think it has good sides to it and it has bad sides to it. I would hope the good sides could overcome the bad ones if we act legislatively to curtail online abuse, and if we find ways of getting our kids to limit the amount of time they spend on it.
Thank you. Let's go to the person just in front. That's it. And then I'm going to set up the next one. So could we have the next mic coming to this gentleman at the front following that? Thank you.
Hello, Dina Kay. What's your answer to the moral situation between Greece and Turkey, where you've got refugees fleeing into Greece and Greece refusing to accept the people?
This is one of the most difficult issues and highlights, I think, the inward turn of many nations. And nations are simply refusing to come together to find some global solution to what is going to be the great migration. It's going to continue over time. It will be accelerated by all sorts of effects, including climate change. And nobody has come to any kind of solution of any kind. And this is one of the things that makes me worry for the future of humanity, to be perfectly honest with you. I wish I had an answer. I don't. This is a problem for the United Nations. It is a problem that will test the ability of different nations to come together for the human good. This is a case where we do actually need what I call for in the book a covenant of global responsibility. And to use human beings as pawns in political games is outrageous and unacceptable. I wish I knew an answer. I don't. I'm sorry.
There's a question at the front here, the gentleman in blue. And then is there another hand that can be primed? Should we go right to the back and we'll come after this gentleman's question has been answered, and then we'll just...
My name is Graham Charkham. Thank you, Rabbi Lord Sachs, for a very helpful interview, and I look forward to reading the book. You've explained during the course of the interview that when writing a book of this kind, there's a choice between writing your feelings and writing what can be heard, and you've explained that you wrote it, as it were, with your left hand. Within these four walls, and it can be edited out of whatever's being recorded, could you tell us what you would have written with your right hand and what you would have written had you been free to express your feelings.
Well, look, if you
The publishers are in the front.
if
here,
you
so
can
that's-
if you can afford the paperback, it's called To Heal a Fractured World. I set out a Jewish ethic. I did that in 2005. In 2002, I published a book called The Dignity of Difference, which is a global ethic. And the one that goes along with this one will be the next but one that I write. So I will do that for you as well, but there are two to be getting on with already.
My goodness.
Already. So would you allow me the indulgence of a supplementary question, which is hinted at in your answer, is the difficulty of finding a common language which can be heard in the society we now live in. Could you give us some hints as to how we go about doing that, finding a common language?
Yeah, I had to do this, when I was first asked to do Thought for the Day. It's... I suddenly realized I was going to have to deliver a Jewish message to an audience 99.5% of whom were not Jewish. And I wanted to find a precedent. And I came up with Jonah, who was sent by God to prophesy to the people of Nineveh, who were Assyrians. I couldn't actually think of anyone else between who had actually had that task of delivering a Jewish message to a non-Jewish audience. So I thought about that very, very hard, and I tried to develop it over the years through Thought for the Day. That is my attempt to say something which I think will speak to everyone, but which is distinctive to me as a Jew. And always the implicit message in my Thought for the Day is, look guys, this is how we see things. And if it works for you, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay, because we're Jewish and we don't try and convert anyone. So it's a kind of very relaxing sort of approach. And, I think it works, actually. I mean, the proof that it works is that they asked me to give Thought for the Day on the day John Humphreys left the programme. And John Humphreys is a little bit ferocious towards Thought for the Day. And they thought I was the only person he wouldn't actually eat up or shred. So, and given that John is himself an agnostic or a verging on atheist, I've discovered this language which seems to work. And I commend it to everyone because, every religious tradition has something to add. And when you have a country with lots of different subcultures, they create, if they see themselves as a collective we, they create not a jangle of discord, but some new and very complex harmony. So, I've always learnt a lot from Christians about, for instance, taking poverty seriously. I mean, that is a really important insight that Christianity has. I've learned from Sikhs how hospitality can be the holiest act you can engage in, because Hindu society is quite hierarchical and a high caste can't serve a low caste. Whereas Sikhism, which grew up in India, in a Hindu society, is a monotheism which is non-hierarchical. So the most distinguished Sikhs serve the really poor and the down and out. So you see something, they call that langar. So, and Islam, for instance, is a perfect example of a faith that's done what almost no other faith has ever done, which is resist secularization. So you can learn all sorts of things and yet still be extremely universal, and I hope that's what I try to do.
I would add, if it's not presumptuous to say something that you've said in the book, that one of the things that really comes through is this sense of the power of the face-to-face, and that actually we're in a high suspicion age, that we see hidden agendas everywhere. And we are primed to react negatively to any sense of the common or any appeal to the we, and we assume that it's a power grab, and that is a very, very deeply entrenched problem. But that when we are face to face with each other, we are able to communicate in a very different way. And so I certainly feel like one of the things that could be developed out of this book is what does it mean to build habits of face-to-face connection in situations of difference as a way of amplifying a sense of we and pulling back from these disembodied, globalized ways of engaging with each other. Question on the back, right at the back row, directly in front of the sound desk. Helpfully difficult to get at.
Do you think that the current Labour Party is moral?
The mic was actually on its way to a gentleman too in your direction. So we might just have those together and then go ahead.
Can I just answer that?
Yes.
Any party that does not eliminate hatred from its ranks, hatred against Jews, hatred against anyone, is not a serious political entity and should not be forgiven by the electorate.
If it's all right, we are going to go to the gentleman who's been patiently waiting for the mic to arrive.
Thank you. My name is Naftali Rabinowitz. So Rav Sachs, in so many of your books you paint a picture of how society ought to be in such a compelling way. However, in order to, I guess, realize this, it's going to require the sacrifice of a number of individuals who are going to have to make it, let's say, their life's work and to make all-consuming sacrifices to realize it, obviously in addition to every individual doing their part. And so my question is, what would you say to young people who are sort of on the verge of, let's say, taking a step in responsibility, but see it as a very large and heavy burden to bear, and in addition one they have to take on voluntarily? Why should an individual make such a large sacrifice, even if it is in the interest of the general cause?
There is a wonderful saying of our rabbis. We just read the passage called Trumah, which deals with the building of the tabernacle in Exodus 25, this last Sabbath. And there is a passage that deals with the ark, the making of the ark, and the poles, and the people who carried the ark. And there is this wonderful saying of the sages, Aaron noseh et nosav. The ark carried those who carried it. They thought they were carrying the ark. Actually, the ark was carrying them. Now, that is precisely what dedication to an altruistic career is about. You think that you're making sacrifices for your career, and you are. But what you are given back in return, in terms of satisfaction, meaning, a feeling of having lived a life that made a difference, that made the lives of others better, that is huge. It is huge, and it is worth the sacrifices. You know, when I did my programs on morality, we had Melinda Gates on, and look, here's a woman who's already given $30 billion in charity, and I said to her, Melinda, not everyone has $30 billion to give. I'm sitting here with a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old British school kids. What will you say to them? And she said to them with such humility, you know, you make one person's life better. Your life has been worthwhile. And if you keep doing that, you will be amazed how many lives you have changed. So yes, these tasks do involve sacrifice. But I have to tell you, they are so meaningful and so rewarding. And now is the time. We've reached a kind of a low in terms of the people who are going into politics, in terms of the tone of the public conversation. And if there is one thing that is clear to me, it was those 17 and 18-year-old kids. I was having on the program the world's experts on politics, sociology, philosophy artificial intelligence, and everyone said the stars of the show were the kids, the 17 and 18-year-olds. They were the ones who understood we. They were the ones who understood morality. They were the ones who understood responsibility. So now is the moment that I think things are going to change. And to be part of that change is to seize the day in a way that no other choice of career could possibly give you. So if you are in any way tempted, I say, please go ahead, and I will humbly follow in your slipstream.
I have a friend called Alex Evans who runs something called the Collective Psychology Project, which works on this stuff, and he often talks about the Churchill speech, where there was a sense of the phony war is over. You know, this is real now for us as a nation at the time. And he didn't minimise the threat, and he didn't tone down what it would cost. But he said, you know, hundreds of thousands of years in the future, people will look back and say that was their finest hour. And it's almost a cliche of rhetoric, but I feel that sense of, yes, it will cost us, but it will be the making of us, and it will be, it will be worth living for, in a way that's very powerful. We have time for one more question. Where are the mics? Could we go to the gentleman just on the end here, and I'm going to sneak in one more at the same time, and we'll come to this question at the bottom here. And I'm very sorry if I've missed you. It's quite bright, the lights, so I'm slightly peering.
Hello, thank you for that great evening. My name is Yona Toledano. I have a question regarding individualism and community. I come from France, as you can tell from my accent, and I've lived like several situations where anti-Semitism came from the fact that people say things about the Jewish community, about how the Jewish community can be closed, or all the cliches and things that can be seen by non-Jewish people about the Jewish community. So my question is, why do you think that sometimes community can lead to hateful cliches and especially anti-Semitism?
Thank you. Do you mind if we just take this one, and then we'll close?
Andrew Casrier, my name. In your bid to reverse the trend that has brought us to this low point, how do you view this from a historical perspective? Was this the inevitable consequence of everything that has gone before? Or have we been turned down the wrong way by some other influence? Is it the result of affluence? Is it the Enlightenment that brought us to a stage where human society no longer needed the old principles of morality?
Anti-Semitism. What is happening in the absence of overarching national community is ethnic and other sub-communities. And those communities turn inward. And when they turn inward, then there can be tremendous suspicion, fear, and so on, one of the other. In France, for instance, and this is not the only source of anti-Semitism, but there are a lot of Muslim communities and Jewish communities living side by side, and the suspicion and hostility between them can be very great. And therefore, that is how community can create suspicion, distrust, and even hatred. And the answer to that is to turn outward and to hold out the hand of friendship across communities. I was sitting, as it happens, with the Prime Minister in 2004, and I said to him, I can see our communities are all turning inward. And I suddenly realized we have now to turn outward. That was when I wrote the book, Teal: A Fractured World, which is a sort of outward-looking book. And we worked pretty hard in Britain. Harder, I think, than they've done in France, because France has always had this problem of laïcité. That it's very difficult to bring religion into the public domain and create the kind of bridges between communities. So the more you have strong inward-looking communities, the more you need bridges between them. And that is a constant ongoing work. And when you do that, you find that other communities stand with you in your hour of need, so that when the Jewish community basically shouted help towards the last general election. The Church of England and the Hindu communities and others stood with us. So community can be good news or bad news depending on how much interchange there is between them. They call that bridging capital as opposed to bonding capital, and it's doable. How much was inedible? There is a cycle in the evolution of societies. And when societies are hungry, they work together. When they're incredibly affluent, they don't. And so there is a move from we to I that happens from time to time within societies. And as I point out in the book, Britain in 1820 was a very I society. By 1850, it was a very we society. It had become remoralized. The same was true in the States. Robert Putnam of Harvard is bringing out a book later this year. I haven't seen the text, but I know what he's doing because I interviewed him on this. Is bringing out a book in which he shows that in 1900, America was a very I society, very, very unequal. And by 1950, it had become a we society because of 2 world wars and the Great Depression. So I think there is a cycle. And that's really why I wrote the book when I wrote the book, because I thought we'd come to the bottom of the cycle, and it now becomes terribly important. It's an opportune moment to get people thinking of the upturn. So I think if we seize the hour, we can make the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Elizabeth, for guiding us through this conversation. I have a slightly daunting task in a couple of weeks of moderating a conversation with Rabbi Sachs and another author of a new book for a Facebook Live, so I've been taking notes at the back, and I have to speak to you afterwards about that. Rabbi Sachs, thank you so much for continuing to be our teacher, our guide, for giving us hope and showing us how we can take the courage to enact on that hope. We are, as always, indebted to you for that, so thank you very much.
Thank you.